Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today to hear about psychological interventions for ADHD across the lifespan. I'm Susie Young. I'm a clinical and forensic psychologist, and I've worked or did work in the NHS for, it must be getting on for 30 years now. And I set up the first national adult ADHD clinic. Well, I set up the psychology service in that clinic in 1994, I think it was, a very long time ago. And over the years, I've developed certain, psychological programs, and mainly because a lot of these programs that we needed weren't really available. So I work with colleagues and we've developed some of them. So I'm going to take the opportunity to tell you a little bit about these today and a little bit about the kind of work and how my work has developed and what I'm doing now, because I'm doing some really exciting stuff. Well, I think it is anyway, with cognitive with mind mapping, using mind mapping techniques. So I shall tell you about that a bit later. So these are my disclosures. And my objectives today are to talk about the different types of psychological treatment paradigms and to consider how the style of delivery will change across the lifespan. And I'm going to emphasize the importance that we map patient needs onto the most appropriate treatment. We need to identify what the problem is if we're going to treat the problem correctly. So I'm going to pepper my talk with examples of specific treatments across the lifespan, starting with working with children using a program that I developed with Jade Smith that we call the Young-Smith Program, which is helping children with ADHD. I'm going to talk about the Young-Bramham Program, which was the program that I initially developed with Jessica Bramham a few years back, which is it's a CBT treatment program for adolescents and adults. And finally, I'm going to talk about working with adults who have entrenched complex difficulties using this psychological mind mapping technique that I've been developing in recent years. So thinking about non-pharmacological interventions for ADHD, I mean, that's a broad umbrella, and there are a lot of different types of treatment that fall under that umbrella. Perhaps the most common is psychoeducation, and psychoeducational techniques aim to provide information and education to parents, families, and teachers about ADHD. This may be delivered through written materials and handouts, maybe signposting them to where they can access additional support and help. But it may also be delivered directly in clinical consultations to family members and to the individuals themselves. And sometimes individuals are invited to attend dedicated group psychoeducational sessions. Psychological therapies are generally more active treatments, providing strategies and techniques for change. They aim to support the individual to acquire more useful ways of coping with their difficulties and skills that they can apply to make change in their everyday life and to succeed within their lives. Most commonly for children, these are behavioural-led interventions that are delivered either to parents or in classrooms. But as young people mature and get older, you tend to introduce more cognitive interventions, and so that you'll be delivering cognitive behavioural therapies more directly to the individual and or social skills training. There are, of course, other interventions that fall under the non-pharmacological umbrella, and these may include increasing physical activity, change to diet, and neurofeedback. There are others, but these are the three that are most frequently talked about, but there is limited evidence for their effectiveness at the moment. So if we take a lifespan approach to psychological treatment, we become aware that the mode of delivery changes. And this changes with the individual's ability to, as the individual's ability to absorb and implement psychological techniques advances as they mature. So you can see here we have a whole set of age groups along here, and the mode of intervention changes from being indirect here and increasing to a much more direct intervention here as they reach adulthood. So here there's a lot of parent training, classroom interventions, and then this becomes extended to include more multimodal approaches involving other individuals perhaps, but also incorporating cognitive techniques. And finally, as adults, we're delivering interventions directly to the adult. You know, psychological interventions, they do play an important role during key life transitions. And I think as healthcare practitioners, we often consider that transition is a healthcare exercise, moving a young person from child services to adult services and all the difficulties that that entails and that everybody faces. But we need to be mindful that there are lots of key life transitions for young people as they grow up. So from this stage, for example, here to this stage, as that's an important stage as young people might leave primary school and move into secondary school. Here they may be leaving school, going to college, going to work, going to university. And in parallel to these academic changes and demands, there might be home moves or changes within the home structure, with siblings or other family members leaving, arriving. So there's a lot of change and things that young people need to adapt to and things that unsettle them. These are things that unsettle them. And it's at this stage that we really do need to consider these unsettling times and modify our psychological treatments for these key developmental stages. We need to be considering carefully what are the most problematic behavioural symptoms at that time and what is their level of understanding of the difficulties. We also need to be aware of their level of understanding and ability to work cognitively as they get older. And sometimes it's a bit like a seesaw. So you have the tools at your disposal, the behavioural tools, the cognitive tools, and you select or may emphasise one above the other, depending on that person's ability and just how well they take to it. So what do clinical guidelines tell us about these approaches? Well, for children aged under 6 and for children aged over 6 who have moderate ADHD, non-pharmacological interventions are recommended first line. So it's a cautious approach, taking a psychological approach initially. But those who request it or those who have persisting symptoms and are really struggling, then medication may be started. For children and young people who are over the age of 6 and who have severe ADHD, together with adults with ADHD, medication is recommended as the first line of treatment. But it's also recommended that this is multimodal and supported by psychological interventions. And I think that gets lost somewhere along the line. As soon as medication is prescribed, it's like everyone wants the medication. And there's this huge expectation sometimes that medication is going to change everything. Well, maybe it does. For some people, they say, yeah, it does. And that's great. But there are many people who take medication and after a while they find that it's not quite what they expected. So they're a bit disappointed. It's not the panacea that they were led to believe it was. And they really want the psychological input to help them because pills don't build skills. And that's what they need, especially adults, because there's a lot of learned behaviours and problems and bad experiences in the past that's the baggage on their back. I'm often asked, what is the difference between all these different types of psychological treatments, and who can do what? So I thought I'd add this slide to explain it, because when we see a client, we're seeing them because they're usually at this stage. There's a problem. And the way the individual will respond to that problem will impact on their symptoms, whether these be their ADHD symptoms, or they could also be other symptoms associated with comorbidity, such as anxiety or low mood. It's important to be mindful that this is not an isolated response, however. It's not as simple as that because of experience. And even children have experiences. You don't have to be an adult to have a whole load of experiences. Hopefully children won't have so many bad experiences, but they are accumulating. So this experience also influences how we might approach, how our symptoms might be affected, and how we appraise the problem as well. So down here, if you're coaching or counselling, what you'll be doing here is you'll be giving advice, you'll be mentoring, you'll be perhaps suggesting techniques that could be tried and supporting the individual to try them. Here, the CBT therapist, the behavioural therapist, the dialectic behavioural therapist or cognitive analytical therapists, they're also working in the here and now. They're working, focusing on what the problem is and how this affects the symptoms being, breaking it down further into what you think about it, the problem, what you feel about it, and what you do about it. So instead of it being a big jumbled mess of, oh, I don't know what to do, it's about teasing it all out and separating it all out so it's more manageable in some way. Up here, when you're working at an experiential level, this is working in schemas, fundamental beliefs about yourself, and this is schema-focused therapy. Now, to do this, you really do need to be highly qualified, and I strongly recommend that people who are approached for this are on the Health and Care Professions Council register. I've marked this down here. It's amazing how many people are not, but get asked to do this type of work. But psychologists who are on the HCPC register are registered to provide services to the public. So that's an important thing to remember to look up. It gives you a certain protection. So now, talking about working with children, I'm going to tell you about the Young-Smith Programme. And what is this? Well, it's actually a CBT intervention for children aged 6 to 12, and it focuses on the relationship between cognitions, what we think, our affect, how we feel, and the body response, how this affects the body and our behaviour, what we do. So it's sort of separated down here like this. So we might have a thought, for example, I can't do this, it's too long, I'm never going to manage this. And the feeling is, oh, this is hopeless, I'm upset, feeling distressed. Body response might be head down, being a bit cowed, being distressed, feeling the energy reduces, feeling I just can't, the body, you just can't do this. And the behaviour perhaps is that you're distracted, you give up, you don't do it. And all these things all interact with each other. The Young-Smith Programme is delivered by healthcare, can be delivered by healthcare professionals, parents, carers, teachers, and it has also been involved in those in other agencies that support children with ADHD. And the reason that can be done is because it has a high level of structure within the book. You can get it on Amazon. There's no huge costs associated with this programme. So the content has a general introduction and tells you about the programme. And then there are various modules. And the first module, this one, the introduction to Buzz and his family, followed by modules on attention, hyperactivity, impulsivity, anxiety, frustration and anger, social skills and relationships, setting goals and planning ahead, problem solving, mood, and self-esteem. Now, it's really important to assess the problem because you need to select the right modules to match the problem. So you have to identify and define the problem in your assessment. So a child might be struggling or unhappy at school, and they're not concentrating, they're doing badly in the classroom, and everyone's focusing on the poor attention control, when in fact what it is they're very distressed because they're also being bullied but haven't told anyone. So it's about really getting that problem very clear so you know what modules would be appropriate. Now, I'm sure you're wondering what this chapter 3 was, Introduction to Buzz and his family. And this is because it works around this family, a character called Buzz and his family. Each module contains worksheets that describe the adventures and difficulties encountered by Buzz in his everyday life. There are 2 worksheets generally per module. So you have a selection as to what might be the most appropriate, even within the module. Within the worksheet, there is a stimulus sheet, which tells a story about Buzz and a problem that he's got. Then there follows a discussion sheet, which the therapist has, and the therapist prompts the therapist to pose questions to the child relating to the story. And then there follows a task sheet where the child completes exercises. And they write out ideas, for example, that might help Buzz with the problem. So this is worksheet 1, and here's Buzz and his family. And this first worksheet, which has to start, everything has to start with this worksheet, but it aims to build a therapeutic relationship and promote the child's ability to express themselves. And you use the stimulus sheet to introduce Buzz and his family. And in the discussion sheet, you switch between Buzz and his family and the child themselves. And you do this in all of them. So, for example, you might be talking to the child about what you think Buzz is good at, because he's in the information in the stimulus sheet, it talks about him, about not being very good at school, etc. And so you might say, well, what is he good at? What might make him happy or sad? And you encourage reflection for the child to think about this family and Buzz. And then you say, well, tell me about your family. Let me hear a little bit about you. What's your school like? What do you like about school? What do you do outside of school? You got any hobbies or interests? Okay, now let's go back to Buzz. What do you think he might find difficult? So we're moving now from the positive to the negative, the difficulties. And you notice we've moved from Buzz to child and now back to Buzz. What might he find difficult? What do you think he worries about? And then back to the child. Do you find things difficult? What do you worry about? And then there's homework is always called a home mission. And for this one, it's about you ask them to draw a picture of family, draw a picture of their family. They add photographs and colour pictures. They illustrate it in some way. Then this is just the first introductory session, and then you will move on to further sessions depending on what the problem has been, what you've identified the problem to be for the child. So you might move on to, for example, an anxiety worksheet. So there's one that's about Buzz goes camping, and this is all about Buzz having to go away from home for the first time, and he wants to go because it's a big exciting thing with the Boy Scouts, but he also is a bit anxious because he's never really been away from home before. The frustration one in the frustration is Buzz reads a book, and this is about Buzz who is struggling, doesn't read very well as everybody else in his class, and he is given homework to read, and he's he's reading this book, and he's getting so annoyed with it and so frustrated because he can't do it and he can't get it right, and he throws the book down onto the floor. So you use these as the stimulus sheets. You ask the child about Buzz's thoughts and feelings. You ask them about their experience then. And then you ask them and think, right, let's go back to Buzz in the task sheet and say, well, what might help Buzz to do his homework, to read the book? What do you think might happen? Come up with ideas, lots of ideas, and you help the child to come up with ideas. And then you go back to the child and say, well, what one of these, one or two, let's find one or two of these that you think might help you to do this with your difficulty. And then you circle it and colour it in. And often I've found that children, sometimes to begin with, they won't tell you about their own problems. I mean, why should they? You rock up as a stranger talking to them. But what I have had is that they say, well, I haven't had this problem, but my friend has in school. So you end up talking about, well, how might you help your friend? But it's still identifying things, and slowly things change and they'll tell you more. So moving on, working with adolescents and adults, I'm now drawing on the Young-Bramham Programme. And that is based on a paradigm that we developed that's in the programme that looks at things. Well, we start off with our neuropsychological deficits. You have ADHD, which means you have, difficulties concentrating and poor impulse control, you're restless, all these sort of deficits and problems that are here, that's kind of your pre-wiring, I call it now. And then there's all the life events and experiences. And then there's a situation and a task. And then you succeed at this or you fail at this. And whether you succeed or fail depends on the whole interplay of all this, plus the ADHD symptoms that might come in. So then they have something that they have to do. And this is where appraisal kicks in, because whether they succeed or fail at it will depend on all these things. If they succeed, then they appraise it positively. It's all hunky-dory. They think positively about it, they feel positively about it, and they behave in a positive way, and that's all great. This is where we want people to be. If they don't succeed in doing it, then they think negative things about it. They feel negatively about it, and they behave negatively about it, because it's all part of a negative appraisal system. So what I see as my job as a therapist with people with ADHD who often have had a lot of bad experiences in the past, plus they've got their symptoms, sometimes they do end up too often on this side of the slide. So I'd say my job is the key is to get them to reappraise it, to think about the difficulty or problem differently so that they can shift over to this side. And I think what works well for people with ADHD is that they are able to do this because they are resilient. Some people don't like the word resilience, but I do. And I think that people with ADHD are resilient. It's not to say that they don't get hurt or they don't get distressed or they don't struggle, but they are resilient. They will try. And actually, not only do they try, they'll try very enthusiastically until they get a bit fed up with it all again. So you've got to catch them in that moment and get them, and they will bounce back. So this was the theoretical sort of paradigm that Jessica Bramham and I sort of developed all those years ago. And the program is for adolescents and adults. And like the Young-Smith program, it's a sort of pick and mix style of independent modules and you can use it as boosters as well. So you need to identify the problem and then pick the modules that are most appropriate. And there's all sorts of guidance for therapeutic collaboration and, as I said, module-specific sessions, information about how to deliver it, lots of information about the therapy style, and all the materials can be downloaded from the Wiley website. And it's the same with the Young-Smith program as well. This is what went into the program. We it could be for adults, so it's a bit more sophisticated. So we were able to include cognitive remediation strategies, cognitive reframing of the past, cognitive restructuring and reasoning, rationalization, as well as compensatory strategy development and behavioural techniques. So you can see how we've moved very much into a much stronger cognitive behavioural therapy paradigm here. The structure of the book is to give you basic advice about ADHD and the actual intervention. And then there follow modules on core symptoms of ADHD, on attention, memory, organisation, time management and impulsivity. There follow modules on comorbid and associated problems. So problem solving, interpersonal relationships, anxiety, frustration and anger, low mood, and depression, sleep problems and substance abuse. And then there's a future module. And we put that in because I've learned, people with ADHD, they're all quite worried about their future. They want to know, where is this going? Well, how long is a piece of string? I don't know when the symptoms will change. I don't know whether they will. I don't know what path they will take in their lives. Who does? But what we do know is to giving them information and education about the disorder and about what we know about its progression is very helpful. And also aiming as well by the end to raise self-esteem and improve self-efficacy. So there's a greater belief in themselves that they can achieve. I think you'll notice with both programs, I'm talking about ADHD and other comorbid difficulties and problems in their presentation. There are many programs that don't do that. They just focus on the executive functioning deficits. But the reason I did that is because it's not in isolation. People need that additional help because they are anxious, they are worried, they are frustrated, they are angry, they do have sleep problems. They do have interpersonal relationship problems, and these books are written for people with ADHD, bearing in mind their ADHD symptoms, but also with these types of programs. And you can select with these types of problems, I meant to say, and you can select the module that's most suitable. And even within that module, you have quite a lot of choice as to how you provide the treatment. So, for example, in the organisation and time management problem, you're encouraged to identify and define the problem. Really important. So do they make plans or don't they make plans? There's planners and there's non-planners. And there's planners in their head, and the problem is they don't write it down. So, you really need to know what is the problem, what is causing the organisation and time management problems. Do they break goals down into steps? Do they set goals, or do they just wake up and think, oh, I fancy doing this today? They don't prioritize anything. Do they write things out? Are they making lists, using a diary and reminders? I can't tell you how many times I've treated people who they just don't make lists. They just don't write things down. And especially if you don't have a good memory, you need to do those things. Then you teach them, once you've identified it, then you plan, you titrate the intervention according to the problem that you've identified. So you will apply a stepped time plan. You'll set goals and break them into achievable steps. Sounds silly, but this is all a process. What I find you have to do with people with ADHD is teach them a process, because we all do stuff automatically. But what they do is they go beginning and jump to the end. There's nothing in the middle, so they lose the process. So you teach them the skills, but then you also need to teach them the process. I get them to think afterwards, what have we done? And I actually get them to write it down. This is the process, because they need a blueprint, a template that they can apply to lots of different organisation and time management problems or other problems. So set goals and break into achievable steps, schedule tasks, schedule it. So many times it stops. They don't do that to actually get it down. I'm going to do this on Monday at 10 o'clock and this on Wednesday at 3 o'clock. And of course, really important for people with ADHD is to incorporate planned breaks and rewards, because that's motivating as well as rewarding. So here We're talking about coaching techniques to go back as to what belongs to what area of psychological treatment. So you could call the setting goals and steps, lists, alarms, diaries, and all that jazz. That comes under like a classification more of coaching techniques. Psychologists do this as well, but and positive thinking and mentoring. Breathing, relaxation is very important. These kind of techniques. And especially for if there are interpersonal problems present, which usually there are somewhere, whatever the issue is, we set behavioural experiments. And that's basically you change your behaviour and sit back and observe how it changes the behaviour of others. And I'm always setting homework for setting behavioural experiments. I have no idea how they'll work out, and they don't until they try it. And sometimes they come back and give information and we tweak it a bit and they go off and they do it again until we get it right. So it's about setting behavioural experiments. And it's very interesting because if you change your behaviour deliberately and in a small, subtle way, that will also change the way other people interact with you. So those are the kind of coaching techniques. Now, the CBT is a bit more advanced, and and you need to understand about basic CBT techniques. And in the training, we all go through all this training. It's a lot of training, but actually, it's quite difficult to really explain it to a client. So what we've devised, I tell my clients that CBT is a three-legged table. Here's the table. The problem is on the top of the table up here. And what holds up the table is what you think about that problem, what you feel about it, and what you do about it. Now, I can teach you strategies. There are many strategies that can knock out these legs. And the good news is that we only need to knock out one of the legs and the table falls over. But of course, it's better if we can knock out more than one leg. And so here is a model that I have with various strategies, for example, that I've written down here for knocking out the thought leg. So this is the cognitive side. You can challenge thoughts, you can distract yourself from them, and you can use a method I call superimposing thoughts. Basic strategies for knocking out the feelings might be breathing and relaxation, and something called progressive muscle relaxation. And I've put something together on my website called Central Control, which incorporates both progressive muscle relaxation techniques and mindfulness techniques at the end. It's free to access on my website, and people seem to like it. Behavioural, the techniques to knock out the behavioural leg could be to withdraw, to learn when to withdraw from a situation. But if it's dysfunctional that you withdraw because you don't want to go out, for example, and face something, then that is dysfunctional. But if you're withdrawing because you don't want to lose your temper, then that's functional. So depends on what the problem is. Changing your body posture deliberately can be a good intervention here, and teaching yourself to speak calmly and slowly, because when people with ADHD get aroused and upset, their volume goes up, the pitch goes up, their arms start going, and it's all sort of going like this. And what I teach them is the Margaret Thatcher technique, which is to speak low and slow, to teach them to calm things down a bit. So another example here is for interpersonal relationship problems. I mentioned them before. It's so important to identify and define the problem. You need to get a clear picture of the problem. Does the problem relate to specific people? Does it relate to specific settings? What are the circumstances? Is anxiety or temperament playing a role in here? Is it a communication problem that you're misreading social cues, or people are misreading yours? What have other people said to you about this problem? And you may need to assess their conversation and listening skills. And there's all sorts of support in the book to help you to do this. Well, the treatment strategies for interpersonal style and communication problems would be manifold, and you would select, depending on what the issue is and the difficulty is, you select what strategies you might use. For example, verbal communication, you might pay attention to your tone of voice, volume and pitch, and you role play. I role play so much with my clients because I want them to get it right with me in the session, so I'm confident that when they go out in the world, they will get it right then. So it's all about role play and working things out. Same with non-verbal communication. This is about perhaps emotion recognition, getting it right, and social cues. And here I might practice emotion recognition by looking at photographs. So what let's see, what do we think this person's feeling or thinking? Looking through magazines, playing, have the mute on the television or on a computer. So one of my clients said to me, Susie, you've got to come into the age, Suze, because we don't watch television anymore. It's all on computer. So muted television. And soap operas are really great for that because there's always so much going on in them. There's a lot of expressions and lot happening to talk about when they're muted. And again, you can role play and discuss body language. You can work on modifying and regulating behavior, such as, rehearsing conversational rules. I call this the ping pong. If you say hello, someone says hello back. How are you? I'm fine. How are you? It's like a ping pong. And often with ADHD clients, it's either talking too much so the other person can't get a word in edgeways, or sometimes they don't answer the question, or they just shut down. They just answer the question and they don't say any more. And it's because they're thinking about what else they want to do, or they're thinking about something completely different. So I role play ping pong, verbal ping pong with them. Maybe get them to listen to constructive feedback and avoid hypersensitivity and interrupting. Might discuss as well, if it's present, overcompensations. These are things like, playing the joker, acting out all the time because they think they'll be popular then and they'll get a social network. Also getting a social network, perhaps by getting in with a bad crowd or being promiscuous. Some strategies for overcoming social anxiety might be necessary, or for frustration and anger, depending on the problem. And there you see, you would cross over into other modules and take parts from that module. So I've talked about this level and I've talked about this level, but we've been working very much in the here and now here. And what happens with the clients, in what I've discovered, is that we get to a stage where they've sorted out the here and now and they're much more confident and things are working out and things are much better. And then sometimes they sort of say, yeah, but why all this baggage? What's happened with all this? Where's it all come from? And that's where I started to do work with fundamental beliefs about themselves and how they've been formed, and using schema focused therapy. And this is most likely to be helpful for adults, and you wouldn't do this kind of work with teenagers, but with sort of 25 plus adults, right through to 50s and 60s, even older. And often they're presenting with complex problems. And this is quite new. I've only just really started talking about it, just because it was a client of mine actually who said to me, I'm finding this so helpful, Susie, you really should write about it. So I've started to talk about it first. And the techniques I've developed, I call psychological mind mapping. And bit flamboyant, I know, but I am flamboyant. I call it a voyage into the development of the mind. And what I mean by that is because I'm using mind mapping techniques, which we're used to thinking that are like about in this way. It's the here and now. It's mind mapping leading to ideas and thoughts and putting things together, and then you start to map things up. We're also familiar with these techniques, for anyone who watches, crime series and crime dramas, because we see this called the crazy wall on police walls, and they're using mapping techniques here to link ideas, but also to link information and to look for for things that are consistent or that come up within the map. Now, so I'm using a mind mapping technique in schema focused therapy. So the mind mapping isn't just in today. The mind map is taking us back from where we began, from here, from our pre-wiring, all the way down to the here and now. So you'll probably see here how my thinking has developed, because you'll recognize this from the earlier days when this was developed for the Young-Bramham Programme, and right down here to the three-legged table. What this is, we think, and I get my clients to do this. I get them to, this is all written out. These are just the headings. So they take what I call the pre-wiring. What's their pre-wiring? And I don't just want ADHD or ASD or, congenital problems or whatever. I want to know what that means to them. I can't pay attention. I can't plan. That they write down what these key difficulties are. It's the pre-wiring. And then I get them to divide that up and to look at these things that they've written here, and then think, how do these affect my behavior? How does this pre-wiring, what does this mean for my behavior? And how does it affect me emotionally in terms of my emotional functioning? And they write that out. So now we're starting to tease things out into another box, for want of a different word. And then we move down, and then we think about life events and experience. Everything that we have, the pre-wiring, and then we have our lives. And I get them to write out the life events, things that are really important. And do you know what? It could be a small thing that somebody else wouldn't think is important, something someone said to them at a key moment that they've never, ever forgotten, but impacted hugely on them. So they write out the list of life events, and I get them to sort of describe them as if they were describing it to somebody else. And then this part, the experience of these life events, is what they learned from that life event. And in the course of going through this, the life events, you might get experience and life events. To begin with, it all becomes, ideas just go down, and then we start to tease them apart, and we might look at this and say, no, actually what we've got here, this is what you've learned from it, so we'll move this to over here. So we're starting to separate all these things out. So we got the pre-wiring, how it affects them behaviorally and emotionally. We've got their life events and what they've learned from these life events. And then that takes them to, well, so who am I? So this is all the background. So who am I? Now, everything in grey here is in our subconscious. It's not, because we're living it. This is part of our development. So you think, who am I? And I use various techniques to identify early maladaptive schemas about yourself. So the techniques that you can use, and they might boil down to being, I'm useless, I'm unlovable, I'll always be alone. So we identify those. Now, these have been formed in our subconscious from our pre-wiring and our life events and experience. But now in this process with me, we're making this overt. It's becoming recognized. It's like looking in a mirror. This feels then we separate out again. How do I feel about myself and how I function? What does this mean? My beliefs about myself, how does this affect me? Now, at a subconscious level, this is very uncomfortable, isn't it? Say, to feel I'm useless or I'm unlovable. So to protect ourselves as we grow up, we set what I call life rules. And these are if-then statements. So if I get a job and I earn a lot of money, then I'm not useless, right? So, and that job might be a criminal activity, but it's if and then rule. So if I do this, then I'll be okay. If I have lots of men in my life, if I'm highly desired by men sexually, then I'm lovable. So you have these life rules, and they're often maladaptive rules that they live their lives by. And again, it's all in grey. This is all, until we're unearthing this, we're moving, by unearthing this in the therapy, we're moving from the subconscious to the conscious. So then we have these life rules. And then when we've got that, we've unearthed it all, then we revisit, we go back to here and we map the schemas onto the life events. We go through the life events again and say, well, what schema here? Was this I'm useless? What's driven this your experience here in this schema? And you look for shifts in the schemas, because sometimes they move. You find that one schema is more prominent early on in life, and then suddenly something else is overtaken because of other life events, and then something else quite different has become more prominent. So you revisit your life events and you revisit the experience. Remember, that's what you've learned from it. And you're doing this with new eyes. You're doing this because this has all been developed as a child. Now you're looking at this as an adult and you're able to see it very differently. So, for example, I had a client who had a real big problem, who was very, never got on with her mother very well. There was a distance between them that she could never understand, and they never communicated very well. And in the course of the treatment, when we looked at this, it was clear that there were a lot of life events to do with her mother. And so it gave me the clue that we needed to really focus on that. And then we found out in the course of the conversation that and her finding things out about the time of her birth, that her mother had postnatal depression. So I sent her homework to find out about postnatal depression and how this impacts on the mother and the child and their relationship. And suddenly seeing that from not in a child's eyes anymore, but with an adult's eyes, she didn't see it as being herself as being unlovable and being rejected. She realized that her mother had been ill. So it's quite a powerful thing to do this. It's not always as simple as that, I have to say. But then when we've been through this and we've got this new understanding, because this is done in the conscious again, then when you have a critical incident or a situation that would activate the schema, instead of this schema being activated that were created here, instead of them being and everything, the symptoms being present, the way you appraise things and affecting your thoughts, feelings and behavior, the schema's weakened. You weaken the schema here so that when something happens, you cope better with it, you appraise it differently. It's not so harmful and it's not so hurtful. So that's sort of my developing paradigm that I'm working on. And, what is the aim of this treatment? And, and I get, the client gets detailed kind of categories. They come with this lot of misunderstanding and feeling very distressed and not understanding and not, and we've categorized it all out and we're putting a framework of understanding, of development on it. And it's mapping it so that they can understand how this has happened over time. And it's very important, this move from subconscious to conscious. Well, you can't change the past, but you can understand and accept it. And just accepting it sometimes is helpful. The aim is to understand and reflect on their developmental pathway, to look for and identify the schemas and look for cumulative effects. So like in one of the patients I was talking about, it was I'm defective was an original schema, and it moved to I'm alone, and then I'm dependent. So the schema is almost like escalated. Then you weaken the schema, because the schema has been formed through the child's eyes, which is an immature and egocentric looking glass. You're moving between a subconscious to a conscious process. It's like looking in the mirror and you're viewing that schema that was formed as a child from an adult perspective. Then you revisit life events and you map schema development and escalation. And in doing that, I'm looking for switches. It's really important if you find a switch, like I did recently, a change or a break away from a schema, something got weakened alone, and why? What happened in that person's life that weakened that schema? It can be very helpful and very informatively. informative. Then you might want to cognitively reframe some of the events that led to that schema being developed, because you're looking back at it with different eyes now. And this new insight will impact on your future appraisal, perspective, and your response to challenges and problems. Schema-focused therapy was originally developed for people with personality disorder, but it's all about experience. And I'm not saying that people with ADHD have got personality disorder, but they have got disturbed development. They have grown up. We all know, we hear that saying, feeling that they're stupid, feeling that they're to blame for things. They're the black sheep of the family, never having done so well as everyone else in their family. They've internalized all that. And that is what gives them some of these negative schemas. So I'm finding this work progressive and quite new, and I'm finding a way of reaching them with this, linking it with the mind mapping techniques. And I'm finding that it's really exciting, and it really is working. I will write about it soon. So the bottom line is, what I think about this is, if you know where the rocks are under the water, then you can navigate a safe route around them. And that's what I'm aiming to do with them, to help them to reframe things that way. Okay, thank you very much for listening. And I really hope you got to the end of that bit, especially when I was talking about the complex problems, because people with ADHD often do have complex problems. And I'm very excited about what I'm developing here and the progression of this technique by merging it with mind mapping techniques.